Desiree Long had long ago traded in the luxury of sleep for the grind of survival. Each morning, she awoke before the sun had even thought to rise, the alarm cutting through the silence of a home that had long ceased to feel like a sanctuary. Her husband, Calvin, was still lost in his dreams, unaware of the daily ritual that had become her life. Desiree's world revolved around 5 jobs, each one a strand in the web she wove daily to keep her family afloat, or at least to keep Calvin's lies hidden beneath layers of exhaustion. She moved quietly through the house, pulling on her worn uniform. The fabric clung to her skin like a reminder of her exhaustion, each shift pressing deeper into her bones. But Desiree never complained. Complaining was a luxury she couldn't afford. She brewed a pot of cheap coffee, the bitter scent filling the small kitchen, and checked her phone, her schedule waiting, as predictable as the day before. By 6 a.m., she was out the door, heading to her first job of the day, cleaning offices downtown. The office buildings glittered around her, their glass walls reflecting a life she could never touch. Desiree scrubbed the fingerprints from the windows, looking out at the city she barely recognized anymore. Her fingers ached, her arms trembled under the weight of the work, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. Every dollar she earned was funneled into the account Calvin had set up in his name, an account that, despite his reassurances, was anything but temporary. By 9 a.m., Desiree had changed into her cafe uniform, a nameless apron tied around her waist. She smiled through the exhaustion as she poured coffee for people who would never notice her. She moved through the motions with the precision of someone who had long since learned the art of surviving the invisible. There was no time for dreams, only for the next shift, the next task, the next dollar. At noon, she caught the bus across town to her warehouse job, lifting boxes with hands that were already raw from the morning's work. The pain was constant, but so was the quiet, steady belief that she was doing what she had to do. Calvin had promised it would all be worth it. Just a little longer, he said. And Desiree had believed him, because believing him was easier than facing the reality of the life she was building alone. By late afternoon, she was tutoring online, her voice steady even as her head throbbed. The evenings were no better. When most people were winding down, she was stocking shelves at a grocery store, her legs aching from the day's marathon. Each job blurred into the next, and Desiree learned how to exist in a state of exhaustion so deep it felt like a second skin. She didn't complain, not out loud. She didn't want to burden anyone with her struggles. But the truth was there, in the heavy silence that hung between her and Calvin. The gratitude he once expressed had disappeared like the dinners he used to cook for her. His kisses had turned into nods, his praise into demands. "You're good at this," he would say, his words casual but the meaning sharp, designed to keep her in line. At first, Desiree had believed him. She believed the story he told her, about the debts, the bad investments, the friends who needed favors. But as time wore on, the cracks in the narrative began to show. The dinners stopped, the compliments turned into cold instructions, and Desiree began to notice things she hadn't before. Calvin's clothes were sharper, his watch upgraded, his scent more expensive, but the money never seemed to stretch far enough to cover the bills. When Desiree asked questions, he dismissed her concerns with irritation. "You wouldn't understand," he'd say, brushing her off as if her worries were inconvenient distractions from the life he was building. His life, not theirs. One evening, after a 14-hour shift, Desiree stopped by the bank to deposit her paycheck. It was routine, automatic, even. She slid the check across the counter, ready for the transaction to be over. But then the teller paused. "I'm sorry," the woman said, her eyes flicking back to the screen. "There seems to be an issue with this account." "An issue?" Desiree frowned. "What kind of issue?" The teller hesitated, glancing nervously at the screen before lowering her voice. "Your available balance is restricted." Restricted? The word sat heavily in Desiree's chest. She didn't understand. Calvin had assured her everything was fine. that they were just going through a rough patch. But now there was a restriction. The teller explained that certain withdrawals had triggered a review, large withdrawals, frequent ones, the kind that didn't add up. Desiree didn't say anything as she left the bank. Her mind raced, her body moving on autopilot, one foot in front of the other as the cool air hit her face. Something was wrong. She knew it. But Calvin had always been so convincing, so sure of himself, that she dismissed the doubts that had crept into her mind. But that night, when Desiree came home and Calvin was sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone with a glass of whiskey in his hand, something shifted. He barely acknowledged her entrance, too absorbed in his own world to care about hers. Desiree didn't mention the bank. She didn't confront him. Not yet. But the seed had been planted. It wasn't until the next day, when Desiree was standing in the grocery store after her warehouse shift, that the truth began to surface. Her card didn't work. The machine beeped, asking her to insert it again. The cashier's practiced smile didn't hide the discomfort as Desiree felt the heat creep up her neck. "Is there another form of payment?" the cashier asked. Desiree didn't have anything else. The transaction was small, but it felt huge. She removed the bread, the rice, the soup, and watched them slide back along the conveyor belt. She had never felt so invisible. At home that night, Calvin was lounging, relaxed, with a drink in hand. "The card didn't work today," Desiree said, keeping her tone even, though her heart pounded in her chest. "Which one?" Calvin asked, still not looking up from his phone. "The shared account." He didn't react immediately, just a long pause before he shrugged and mumbled, "Yeah, there's some movement right now. Temporary stuff." Desiree's pulse quickened. Movement? What did that mean? But she didn't press him. She never did. She had learned long ago that some questions didn't get answers. They got excuses. But that night, when Desiree lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she made a decision. This was the moment, the point of no return. She couldn't keep going like this. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine, that Calvin's lies were just temporary. The cracks had shown themselves, and now it was time to face the truth. The question now was, how much longer would she let herself be invisible? The days blurred together for Desiree. Each morning was a repetition of the last, the endless shuffle of jobs and responsibilities. But something inside her had shifted after the conversation in the grocery store, the moment when she had realized just how much control Calvin had over her life, and how little he seemed to care about it. Desiree went through her routine with a quiet purpose. She woke before the sun, the world around her still dark, just as it had always been. Her first job, cleaning offices downtown, didn't seem to weigh on her as it once did. The physical strain, the constant motion, had become second nature. She no longer felt the ache in her back or the sting in her hands from scrubbing glass. They were just part of the cost, part of the deal she had made with herself to survive. But now, there was a quiet fire burning within her. Desiree had spent too many years in the shadows, too many years serving Calvin's whims without questioning, without demanding more. She had been invisible, not to him, but to herself. She had allowed herself to believe in his promises, in his assurances that everything would be fine. But the truth was creeping in, and she was finally starting to see it. By 6 a.m., Desiree was on her way to the warehouse job. She rode the bus across the city, her face expressionless as she stared out the window, the world rushing past. It was the same bus ride she'd taken 1,000 times before, the same buildings, the same streets. But now, as her mind churned with new awareness, everything looked different. The warehouse was cold, but Desiree didn't mind. She moved through the motions, lifting boxes, organizing stock, doing what was expected of her. But as she worked, her mind raced back to the moment in the grocery store. The way Calvin had dismissed her concern with a shrug, the way he had never once acknowledged how tired she was, how much of herself she had given up. That night, when Desiree returned home, Calvin was already on the couch, scrolling through his phone. His glass of whiskey sat on the coffee table, untouched for now. Desiree didn't feel the anger that had once consumed her in moments like this. No, it wasn't anger she felt. It was something else, something quieter. "Calvin," she said, her voice steady. "I need to talk to you." He glanced up from his phone, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What about?" "I went to the bank today," she said, keeping her tone calm, but firm. "And there's something I need to understand." The tension between them thickened. Calvin didn't look surprised, but he did seem uneasy. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice low. Desiree crossed the room, sitting down on the edge of the couch. She didn't want to confront him, not yet. But this was different. She had spent years pretending everything was fine, but now it was time to stop pretending. "The account," she began slowly. "The one you've been handling. There's a restriction on it. There were withdrawals that shouldn't have been there." Calvin's eyes flicked briefly to his phone before he set it down and looked at her, his expression guarded. "It's just some movement, Desiree. Temporary stuff. You don't need to worry about it." "Why am I always the one left in the dark?" Desiree asked, her voice rising slightly despite her attempts to remain calm. "Why is it always me who's expected to clean up the mess? Why do I have to work 5 jobs to pay for your mistakes?" Calvin's face shifted. His smile was gone now, replaced by a frown. "I told you it's temporary," he repeated, more forcefully this time. "Just keep working, and I'll handle the rest." Desiree felt the familiar sting in his words, the same words he had used over and over again to control her, to keep her in line. But she didn't react. Instead, she stood, walking slowly to the kitchen. Her legs felt heavy, but there was something different about the way she moved. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't retreating. "I'm tired of handling everything alone," she said quietly, her back turned to him. "I'm tired of carrying the weight while you live a life I don't even recognize anymore." Calvin didn't respond. There was nothing more to say. Desiree didn't wait for an apology or an excuse. She knew better than to expect that. Instead, she gathered her things for her next shift, leaving him to stew in his silence. As she walked out the door, Desiree's mind raced. She had been carrying the burden for too long, and now, finally, she was starting to see the cracks in the foundation. She wasn't going to let herself be invisible anymore. She wasn't going to keep paying for Calvin's mistakes. The debts, the lies, the manipulation, it all had to end. She couldn't do it all at once. She had learned patience from years of waiting for change that never came. But now, Desiree understood that the power was hers to reclaim. She didn't need to burn everything down to rebuild. No, this time, she would do it quietly. She would gather the pieces and put them together in a way that made sense. And when the time came, Calvin would finally understand the price of underestimating her. That night, after another exhausting shift, Desiree sat at the kitchen table. She didn't rush. She didn't panic. She simply opened her laptop, pulled up the files she had started collecting over the past few weeks, and began documenting everything. Dates, receipts, records from the bank. Every small irregularity that had once seemed insignificant was now part of the story. The truth was starting to take shape, and it wasn't just Calvin's lies that were being exposed. It was the system he had built around her, the system that relied on her silence. Desiree didn't feel anger, not anymore. What she felt was clarity. She was done being his slave. She was done being invisible. And Calvin? He would never see her coming. Desiree had never been one to make a scene. She had always been the quiet one, the one who worked without complaint, who put others' needs before her own, and who believed that if she just kept going, eventually everything would fall into place. But as the days passed and the weight of Calvin's betrayal settled deeper into her bones, the patience she had once relied on began to feel more like a prison. It wasn't the work that wore her down. No, Desiree had been working hard for as long as she could remember, each job a badge of survival. What was breaking her now was the realization that everything she had been doing, every sacrifice, every hour spent grinding, every dollar she earned, was just another piece of a puzzle Calvin had designed to keep her in the dark. She had always assumed that their deaths were just part of a rough patch, a temporary setback. But now, standing in the kitchen, the documents spread out in front of her like pieces of a map she'd been too tired to read before. Desiree realized the truth was far darker than she had imagined. Calvin had been playing a game, and she had been the unwitting pawn. The documents were damning, each one revealing a deeper layer of manipulation. She had begun pulling on threads, slowly unraveling the narrative Calvin had built around her. There was one document in particular that caught her eye, a signed agreement that placed her name on a loan she hadn't known about. It wasn't just his debt anymore. No, it was theirs, and she had never signed anything. Her hands trembled as she looked at the paper again. Her signature wasn't there, but Calvin's had been forged. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. He had manipulated her trust, had used her name to secure a life he hadn't worked for, a life he hadn't earned. Desiree exhaled slowly, steadying herself. There was no time to waste. She had to keep moving, keep pushing forward. She couldn't afford to lose focus now. The more she pieced together the puzzle, the more she realized that the situation was far worse than she had initially thought. Calvin had positioned himself as the savior, the one who made all the decisions. He had expected her to stay in line, to keep paying for his mistakes without ever questioning. But Desiree was done being passive. She was done playing his game. She sat up straighter, her eyes scanning the papers before her. The bank statements, the property records, the signatures she had never seen. Every document was a thread in the web Calvin had woven around her. It wasn't just about the money. It was about control. He had assumed she would never look, that she would never ask the right questions. But Desiree had started asking, and the answers were clear. The next day, as Desiree walked to work, her mind was a whirlwind of plans. She wasn't going to confront Calvin just yet, but she knew what she had to do next. She needed information, real, irrefutable proof of the lies he had been telling her. And that meant going deeper, pulling on more threads. By the time she got to work, Desiree had made up her mind. She would go to the bank, ask the right questions, and get the clarity she needed. She had no intention of backing down, no matter how uncomfortable it made Calvin. She had to know everything, every last detail. The time for ignorance was over. Now, she was in control. That afternoon, Desiree slipped into the bank during her lunch break, the familiar scent of polished wood and paper filling her senses. The air was cold, too cold for comfort, but Desiree didn't mind. She wasn't here for comfort. She was here for answers. She approached the teller, a woman she had seen before but had never spoken to. "I need to check the details of my joint account," Desiree said, her voice calm, almost too calm. She had rehearsed these words 100 times in her head, and now that they were finally out, she felt a strange sense of purpose settle over her. The teller nodded and began typing into the system, her fingers clicking rapidly on the keys. Desiree waited, her gaze fixed on the screen as the details of the account appeared before her. "Is everything all right with the account?" Desiree asked, her tone casual but firm. The teller hesitated, glancing at Desiree before looking back at the screen. "There are some irregularities," she said, her voice lowering. "A few large withdrawals that don't match the usual patterns." Desiree's heart skipped a beat. "What kind of withdrawals?" The teller cleared her throat. "It's not something I can discuss in detail, but it's been flagged for review. It could be temporary, or it could be something more." She glanced at Desiree, her eyes betraying her unease. "It's best to speak with someone higher up about it." Desiree nodded, her mind racing. "I'll take it from here. Thank you." As she left the bank, Desiree couldn't shake the feeling that something big was coming, something that would change everything. She had just begun to scratch the surface, but she knew she was getting closer. Calvin's empire of lies was starting to crumble, and Desiree would be the one to bring it all down. That evening, she came home to find Calvin lounging on the couch, his phone pressed to his ear as he chatted with someone. Desiree watched him for a moment. the casual ease with which he sat there, seemingly unaware of the storm brewing around him. She didn't interrupt. Instead, she went to the kitchen and began preparing dinner, her movements slow and deliberate. Calvin finally hung up and looked at her. "You're home early," he remarked, his voice laced with a hint of surprise. "How's work?" "Busy," Desiree replied, her tone neutral. "I spoke with the bank today." Calvin's expression tightened, but only for a moment. "Everything okay with the account?" Desiree turned to face him, her gaze steady. "We'll see." Calvin didn't respond right away, but Desiree noticed the slight shift in his posture. He was beginning to feel the pressure, and she could see it in his eyes. He had always prided himself on his control, but now, for the first time, it seemed like that control was slipping. As Desiree served dinner, she allowed herself a small smile. The cracks were starting to show. It wouldn't be long now before everything came crashing down. Desiree woke the next morning to the same alarm, the same dreary routine. The sun hadn't risen yet, and the weight of the day ahead already pressed down on her. But today was different. Today, she wasn't just going through the motions. She was moving with purpose. A quiet, determined sense of power had begun to settle inside her, and with it, a clarity that had been missing for far too long. As she made her way through the familiar motions of getting dressed, making coffee, and preparing for another day of backbreaking work, Desiree felt something shift within her. This was no longer about survival. It wasn't about keeping up with the lie Calvin had created or sacrificing herself for a man who only saw her as a tool for his own benefit. No, this was about taking back control of her life, step by step. She took the bus to work, but this time, her mind wasn't consumed by the exhaustion that usually plagued her. Today, Desiree was thinking about her next move. She was thinking about Calvin and how far he'd pushed her. She was thinking about the bank, the documents she had uncovered, and the quiet confidence that now guided her every decision. The warehouse job passed by in a blur, just as it always did. She moved boxes, wiped sweat from her brow, and kept her head down. But inside, her thoughts were racing, focusing on the plan she was beginning to put together. She wasn't just going to expose Calvin. She was going to make him face the consequences of his own actions. And when that moment came, it would be his own choices that brought him down. Not her anger, not her desperation, but the weight of his own lies and manipulation. By the time Desiree finished her shift, it was late afternoon, and her body was aching from the day's labor. She still had 2 more jobs to get through, her online tutoring session and her night shift at the grocery store. But as tired as she was, there was no hesitation in her step. She had made a choice, and now she was moving toward it with steady determination. That evening, after her tutoring session, Desiree found herself at the same bank she had visited a few days earlier. She wasn't here to ask questions this time. No, today was different. Today, she was here to collect the last piece of the puzzle. She approached the same teller who had helped her before, the one who had mentioned the irregularities in the account. The teller smiled when she saw Desiree but didn't ask any questions. The woman simply led her to a back office, where a bank manager waited. "Good evening, Ms. Long." The manager greeted her with a polite smile, though his eyes flicked to her papers, clearly prepared for whatever questions she might ask. "How can we assist you today?" "I need to know more about the account," Desiree said, her voice calm but firm. "I need to know what's been going on, and I need to see everything." The manager's smile faltered just slightly, but it was enough for Desiree to see. He didn't expect her to push for this. He had assumed she would just keep working, keep paying the bills, and never question where the money was going. But now, Desiree could see the discomfort in his posture, the subtle shift of his eyes. He knew she was onto something. "Certainly," he said, his tone a little too smooth. "We can provide you with a full review of the account." Desiree watched as the manager pulled up the records on his computer, his fingers moving swiftly over the keyboard. She had seen these records before, but there was something different about seeing them laid out in front of her now. This wasn't just a series of numbers. This was proof. Proof that Calvin had been lying to her for years. "Here we go," the manager said, his voice stiff. "It looks like there's been an ongoing review of your account. Some of the large withdrawals were flagged due to their frequency and amounts. It's all been under scrutiny, but as far as I can see, everything is in order now." Desiree's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean, flagged?" she asked, her voice steady despite the sudden rush of adrenaline in her chest. "What exactly was flagged?" The manager hesitated, and for a brief moment, Desiree saw the cracks in his polished demeanor. "Certain withdrawals were categorized as unusual," he said slowly, "and they prompted an internal review. There were some larger transfers, ones that didn't fit the pattern of a typical debt repayment plan." Desiree's mind raced. This was it. This was the confirmation she needed. Calvin hadn't just been lying about the debt. He had been using the account for other things, other purchases, other investments that didn't involve her at all. "I'd like to see the full details," Desiree said firmly. "The dates, the amounts, everything." The manager swallowed, clearly uncomfortable, but he didn't refuse. Instead, he opened up the records, each transaction more damning than the last. Expensive dinners, high-end retail purchases, luxury hotels. None of it seemed to relate to the so-called debt that Calvin had claimed was the source of their financial troubles. Desiree didn't flinch. She didn't react outwardly. But inside, a quiet fury was building. This was the man she had married. The man who had told her to trust him. The man who had used her labor to fund his lifestyle, his lies, and his deceptions. He had taken everything from her, and now, she was finally starting to take it back. "Thank you," Desiree said calmly, once she had reviewed the records. "I think I have everything I need." The manager nodded quickly, almost too eager to help her leave. Desiree didn't need to look back. She knew what she had to do next. As she walked out of the bank, Desiree's steps were sure, purposeful. She had crossed a line now. She wasn't just a woman working 5 jobs to pay off her husband's debts. She was a woman reclaiming her power, piece by piece. And Calvin? He wouldn't know what hit him. Desiree didn't sleep that night. The records she'd seen in the bank played over and over in her mind. Each transaction a slap in the face. Each detail more infuriating than the last. Calvin had betrayed her trust in ways she hadn't even considered. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, Desiree didn't feel helpless. She felt prepared. It was clear now. Calvin had been living a lie, and she had been living in it, too. Every justification, every excuse, every promise he'd made to her about their financial struggles, it was all a facade. The accounts, the credit cards, the luxuries, none of it had anything to do with their debts. It had everything to do with Calvin's greed, his need for control, and his total disregard for her. Desiree had stayed in the dark long enough. She had worked herself to the bone for him, paid off his debts, accepted his manipulations, all in the name of love, loyalty, and trust. But now, those concepts felt like hollow words, like tools Calvin had used to keep her in line. It was time to confront him. Not to argue, not to scream, but to demand accountability. To finally hold him responsible for the years of manipulation, for the secrets, and for the betrayal. By the time Desiree arrived home from her morning shift at the warehouse, she had already mentally rehearsed what she was going to say. She knew she couldn't let him control the narrative any longer. She had to be firm, unwavering. This wasn't about reconciliation. This was about ending the lie and beginning her own truth. When Desiree opened the front door, the house was eerily quiet. Calvin's shoes were neatly placed by the door, his jacket draped over the back of the chair, but he wasn't in sight. It was as if he were waiting for her, or maybe just avoiding her. Either way, Desiree knew this moment couldn't be delayed any longer. She took a deep breath and walked into the living room, where Calvin was sitting on the couch, his phone in hand. He glanced up at her briefly, his face unreadable, but his eyes flickered for just a second. It was a brief moment of recognition, a realization that something was different, that things weren't as they had been. Hey, he greeted her casually, like everything was fine, like nothing had changed. How was work? Work was fine, Desiree said, her voice steady but cold. She could feel the intensity in the air between them, the tension like a tightrope strung across the room. She wasn't here to talk about work. I need to talk to you, Calvin. About the money. His expression flickered, just slightly. What about it? Desiree took a deep breath and stepped forward, her eyes fixed on his. I went to the bank yesterday. The words landed between them like a bomb, and Calvin's body stiffened immediately. He didn't speak, but his eyes widened, and for the first time, Desiree saw a hint of fear in them. It wasn't enough. Not yet. You've been using the account for things that have nothing to do with the debt, Calvin, Desiree continued, her voice growing more intense. The luxury hotels, the dinners, the shopping. I've seen everything, and I'm done pretending I don't know. Calvin opened his mouth, but Desiree raised her hand, silencing him. No, you don't get to explain this away. You don't get to keep lying. I've seen the records. You've been using my name for your own expenses, for your own life, while I'm out here working 5 jobs just to keep everything from falling apart. The words were raw, coming from a place deep within her, a place she had kept hidden for so long. The hurt, the betrayal, the exhaustion, it all poured out, unrestrained. Calvin stared at her, his face twisted in a mix of disbelief and frustration. Desiree, you don't understand, he began, his voice strained, but she could see the cracks forming in his calm demeanor. I've been doing this for us. For our future. You don't know what I've been dealing with. Dealing with? Desiree's laugh was bitter, cutting through the air. What have you been dealing with, Calvin? Lying to me? Using me? You've been living a lie, and I've been the fool who bought into it. Well, not anymore. She took a step closer, her voice low but forceful. I'm done. I'm done being your pawn. I'm done sacrificing my life for you. You've been lying to me for so long, and I've let you. But no more. I'm taking control now. Calvin's eyes flashed with anger, but there was something else in them too, fear. He knew this wasn't just a confrontation. It was a turning point. This was the moment when Desiree stopped being the passive, silent partner and became the one in control of her own life. And he wasn't ready for it. I didn't want this, Desiree, he said, his voice shaking now. I didn't want to hurt you. I was just trying to make things work. No, Desiree interrupted, her eyes narrowing. You weren't trying to make things work. You were trying to make me work for you. And I won't do it anymore. For a moment, the room was silent, the only sound the heavy beating of Desiree's heart in her chest. Calvin didn't move, didn't speak. He just sat there, his face a mixture of confusion, guilt, and something else, something Desiree couldn't quite place, but she didn't care to figure out anymore. You'll fix this, Calvin, Desiree said, her tone cold. I don't care how, but you'll fix it. I'll be getting my own lawyer, and you'll be paying for what you've done. I'm not cleaning up your mess anymore. For the first time in a long time, Desiree felt something she hadn't felt in years, empowered. She wasn't waiting for an apology. She wasn't looking for excuses. She was taking back what had been taken from her. The fear that had once paralyzed her was gone, replaced by a steely determination that couldn't be broken. Desiree turned and walked toward the door, her steps steady, her mind focused. Calvin didn't call after her, didn't try to stop her. He knew she had made up her mind. As Desiree stepped outside into the cool night air, she took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the world begin to lift from her shoulders. She was free, finally. And this time, it wasn't just from Calvin's lies. It was from the years of self-doubt, the years of letting herself be invisible. Now, the only thing that mattered was her future, and she was going to take it back. The days that followed the confrontation were a blur for Desiree. She had made her decision. There was no going back now. She was done being the silent, invisible partner in Calvin's life. But as much as she told herself that, the reality of the situation weighed heavily on her. The anger she had felt, the betrayal, still simmered beneath the surface. But now, something else had taken root inside her: clarity. Desiree had always thought she needed Calvin, his promises, his love, his so-called protection. She had clung to the idea that without him, she would be nothing, that she couldn't possibly face the world alone. But now, every time she looked at the documents she had gathered, the records she had seen at the bank, she realized just how far from the truth that had been. She wasn't alone. She was stronger than she had ever been. And as much as it hurt to admit it, she had been the one holding everything together for years, not Calvin. That evening, after her shifts, Desiree sat at the kitchen table, the weight of what she had to do next hanging over her. She had taken all the steps she could. She had the evidence, the proof, the records. Now, it was time to make Calvin face the consequences of his actions. She had been the one who had sacrificed everything, but it was time for him to give something up: his lies, his control, and his deceit. Desiree had already reached out to a lawyer, someone who specialized in financial fraud and family law. She had been hesitant at first, unsure if this was the right path. But as she sat there, the documents spread out before her, it became clear that she had no other choice. Calvin had to be held accountable for what he had done, not just for the money, but for the years he had taken from her. The lies, the manipulation, the emotional toll, it all had to stop. The door to the house creaked open, breaking Desiree's thoughts. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Calvin. She felt the familiar knot of tension in her chest, but this time, it didn't paralyze her. This time, it only reminded her of what she had already decided. She wouldn't be afraid anymore. Desiree. Calvin called from the doorway, his voice tentative, like he was testing the waters. We need to talk. Desiree didn't respond immediately. She didn't need to. Calvin's presence didn't have the same power over her as it once did. She didn't care about his excuses or his promises. She had heard them all before, and they meant nothing now. Finally, she turned to face him. He was standing there, still looking like the man she had married, but somehow different. He had always had an air of superiority about him, an unspoken confidence that bordered on arrogance. But now, Desiree could see the cracks. He was nervous. She could feel it, the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes kept darting around, avoiding her gaze. Desiree, he said again, but this time, there was something else in his voice. A crack, a hint of vulnerability. I know you're upset, but this isn't the way to handle this. Desiree stood slowly, every movement purposeful, every step steady. She had spent so long standing still, waiting for him to change, waiting for things to get better. But now, she was moving forward. She wasn't waiting for anyone anymore. You don't get to tell me how to handle this, Calvin, she said firmly, her voice unshakable. You've taken everything from me, my time, my energy, my trust. And now, you're going to face the consequences. Calvin's face hardened, but Desiree saw the flicker of fear in his eyes. He was losing control. Finally, you're acting irrationally, he said, his voice rising. I've always done what's best for us. You don't understand. This is for the future, for our future. You'll see, once everything settles down, once the debts are paid, you'll understand. Desiree shook her head. I don't need you to fix things for me, Calvin. I've been fixing everything for years. You think you've been protecting me, but all you've done is keep me in the dark. His eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Desiree thought he might lash out. But he didn't. Instead, he took a step forward, his posture tense. You don't know what I've had to do to keep this family afloat. You have no idea the pressure I've been under. Desiree's chest tightened, but it wasn't with anger anymore. It was with something else, something stronger. Something that gave her the clarity she had needed all along. No, she said quietly, her voice cutting through the tension. I don't know what it's like to live a lie, to manipulate the person you claim to love. But I know what it's like to be the one who's always carrying the weight. I've been carrying the weight of this family alone for too long. She walked to the door, opened it, and turned back to him one last time. You're going to fix what you've done, Calvin, she said. I'm done cleaning up your mess. Calvin stood frozen, the words hanging in the air between them. He didn't say anything else, didn't try to stop her. He knew she was right. Desiree stepped outside, her footsteps steady as she walked into the night. She didn't look back. This was the final step. There was no turning back now.